Welcome, everyone, to the Museum of the City of New York. Welcome to tonight's program, Moonlight and Movies, Nuyorican Basquet. I'm Fran Rosenfeld, the museum's Director of Public Programs. Before we get started, I'd like to turn this over to the Babia Collective, who will be providing English and Spanish translation for this evening's program. Pau and Patri, please explain how this is going to work.
Okay, thank you everyone. Muchas gracias a todos. We'll be using the Zoom interpretation feature to do simultaneous interpretation for the event tonight. And I am going to do very briefly consecutive interpreting to explain how it works. And then we will start the simultaneous. Entonces vamos a estar utilizando la interpretación de Zoom para el evento de esta noche. Y voy a explicar esto de manera consecutiva antes de comenzar la interpretación simultánea. For those using computers, you'll see a globe icon at the bottom of your screen with the word interpretation. You can click on it and choose English to hear everything in English, or leave it off if you are fully bilingual. Entonces, para las personas que están usando computadora, va a haber un globito en la parte de abajo de la pantalla y va a decir interpretación. Le pueden dar clic y ahí van a escoger español si quieren escuchar todo en español, o lo pueden dejar apagado si son bilingües y quieren escucharlo en el idioma regular. If you're joining via a smartphone, you can look for the three dots at the bottom that say more. You can click on it, it will prompt the list. You click on language interpretation, and then you choose the same thing, English, Spanish, or off. Entonces, si tienen un teléfono inteligente, le dan a los tres puntitos que está abajo, va a decir más, eso va a sacar una lista, y entonces en esa lista una de esas opciones va a ser interpretación de idioma, y van a escoger pues ahí lo mismo, inglés, español, o dejarlo apagado. And when you choose the language, you click done, so it starts working. Entonces cuando terminen, le dan done o finalizar, y ahí es que comienza lo que escogió. Entonces, the other thing is that there's an option that says mute original audio, and that is to only hear the interpreter's voice. So if you want to hear the voice of the person speaking softly in the background, you can leave it unmuted. Entonces, la otra opción es que hay una opción de silenciar el audio original. Y eso, si hacen eso, solamente van a escuchar la interpretación en español y no van a escuchar la voz de la persona que está hablando. Pero si quieren escuchar a la persona hablando en el idioma original, que es inglés, pues, o sea, un poco más bajito al fondo de la interpretación, lo pueden dejar sin silenciar. Now we're going to turn on the interpretation, and we're going to start doing, and we're going to start interpreting simultaneously. Entonces, después que yo termine de decir esto, vamos a comenzar la interpretación y vamos a comenzar a hacerlo simultáneo. Any issues with the interpretation tech, please let us know. Algún problema con la interpretación, nos pueden dejar saber. Okay, muchas gracias. Thank you. Creo que está, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Our Moonlight and Movies series this summer celebrates basketball in New York City, which is the subject of our current exhibition at the museum, City Game. And this film that we're talking about tonight, Nuyorican Basquet, tells one of the many stories of basketball. I hope you've had a chance to watch this wonderful film made in 2017 on Amazon Prime, or that you will do so shortly. Tonight, we are honored to be joined by a group of commentators, and they're going to talk about the making of the film and the many connections between basketball and Nuyorican identity. We are going to be joined by the film's two directors, Julio Cesar Torres Gonzalez and Ricardo Olivero Lora. We're going to be joined also by organizer and journalist Rosa Clemente, and finally by our moderator, Moncho Lopez, the postdoctoral fellow at the museum. Just a few extra words. Our Moonlight and Movies film series is usually held outside on the museum's back terrace. But we are still so grateful to Sofia and Peter Volandes for their continued support and for making this series possible, even though we've had to move the whole thing online this year. A few things to note. We're going to be taking questions throughout the program via the Zoom question function. So please ask your questions there. We won't have time to get to all of them, but we'll try to get to many. I also invite you to check out the museum's website, mcny.org, for all the upcoming programs and all the other content that we produce. Our next film in the Moonlight and Movies series is called The Dominican Dream. We're going to be doing a conversation about this film on Wednesday, August 26th, joined by New York City high school basketball legend Felipe Lopez, the star of the film, and the director of the film, Jonathan Hawk. So we look forward to seeing you then. And I'd now like to briefly introduce our speakers. You can find full bios on our website, our webpage for this program. Rosa Alicia Clemente is an organizer, political commentator, and independent journalist. She's an Afro-Puerto Rican born and raised in the Bronx, who's dedicated her life to organizing, scholarship, and activism. She's the president and founder of Know Thyself Productions. She was the first ever Afro-Latina woman to run for vice president of the United States in 2008 on the Green Party ticket. Ricardo Oliveira Lora is director, writer, and associate producer of Nuyorican Basquet. His other film credits include Hecho con Sabor a Puerto Rico and Residente. His most recent documentary short, January 23rd, is a chronicle of the confrontation that occurred during a protest in Old San Juan. He is co-founder of Radio Huelga, a student-run, student-founded cooperative radio station at the University of Puerto Rico. Julio Cesar Torres is a director and writer as well for the documentary Nuyorican Basquet. His other films include El Bailao de Julia y Berto and El Rombón de Fepe. Currently, he's directing the feature-length documentary El Grito en los Puños about boxing careers. And last, but certainly not least, our own Moncho Lopez is a researcher, educator, cartographer, and South Bronx-based urban activist. He is currently a Mellon Foundation Fellow at the Museum of the City of New York. Moncho, I'll turn it over to you.
Gracias, Frances. Thank you, and thank you to Julio and to Ricardo and Freddie for such an important and beautiful work. Thanks to Rosa for joining us and helping us contextualize a little bit more deeply this very important subject matter. So I think that we should talk, I'm gonna make a brief historical remark here. The Puerto Rican people are a diasporic nation. Since the United States invaded Puerto Rico in 1898, the emigration out of the island, particularly to New York, has in general grown steadily. And so you can say that the relationship, the political stability, the economic stability of Puerto Rico has been predicated in migration to the United States. A few generations were born of Puerto Ricans, were born here in New York, starting in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And at some point, people began calling these Puerto Rican-born New Yorkers Nuyoricans. It is only natural that at some point, Puerto Ricans from the island and Puerto Ricans from New York were gonna meet again. And so we meet at within very different contexts. You can say that one of the first meeting points is with the very rough reception that the young lords had when they went back to Puerto Rico. And so a second point of re-encounter, you can say it's when we have the phenomenon of the Fania and Salsa occurring here during the 1970s and 1980s. And so here we have this film, this documentary, that narrates the encounter from a very rough meeting between Nuyorican and Puerto Ricans, the young lords, to a very warm and celebratory reception when the salsa phenomenon occurred, to actually having Nuyorican be legally adopted as symbols of the Puerto Rican nation. This happened, as the film says, through basketball. And so I would like Ricardo, Julio, I don't see Julio here, I see Freddie, to talk a little bit about how and why they feel that basketball, that sports, help frame this encounter in a different way compared to the other meeting points.
Well, well, I think that what the main thing that makes this kind of encounter is, I think, you have to go to a class things in the way that what's a class thing, how Nuyorican started playing basketball in New York City, and because we have American citizenship, historically, Puerto Ricans and Black people, especially during the great migration from Puerto Rico and also from the great migration from the south to the north, they started to put Puerto Ricans and Blacks in the same places, you know. So it is naturally, I think it was a natural process that in those places where mostly they have lack of resources, where poor people live, after the women start having babies in New York City, the ones that get from Puerto Rico, these kids start playing with what they have in their life, in their streets. So that was basketball, the basketball courts. So it is impossible to talk about basketball, Nuyorican basketball, if you don't touch the class encounter and the race. Because another thing that is very important, that most of these kids were blacks. Most of the team were black, and that's a very important thing. And that's a very important thing also. I think about the Nuyorican phenomenon, that integration with the African Americans communities, but sadly, that haven't been recognized enough in the island. So that's why we made one of the main reasons that we made the film, because I think that Nuyorican culture has been celebrated, but mostly, of course, it's naturally from Nuyoricans, but there haven't been too much reconocimiento from the island. You know, I'm not a Nuyorican. I lived all my life in Puerto Rico. Julio also, no. So it is a way of giving back all the culture influences that have been going on from a long time, and that even today they're not recognized enough.
Rosa, and so we're talking here very specifically about the year 1979. The film talks about these, sports stars that become demigods in Puerto Rico. They took the island by storm. I remember hearing about the Nuyoricans, and asking my parents, what are the Nuyoricans? And so that very first image that I got of Nuyoricans was Raymond Dalmau and Neftali Rivera, like these very, very talented players. So what was happening at that time here? Do you remember anything? Did you hear anything back then about this phenomenon that was happening in the island? And if you didn't, why do you think that was the case? Like, I would like to hear your perspective from here, from growing up here in New York.
Yeah, I mean, for me, my earliest memories in the Bronx, or my earliest long memory, is the 1977, the New York City blackout. And that was days, you know. By then, where I was at, over on East Tremont and Harrison, people would know who are from the Bronx. But, you know, the Bronx is just a big space as well. Like, it's big. It's I think the second biggest borough in landmass, and also like parks, you know. So, you know, but at that time, I was definitely seeing buildings being burned down, so landlords could get the insurance. You know, a lot of my cousins, I was younger, they were teenagers, and kind of the grip of heroin and joblessness, you know, was severe in the Bronx. So by 1979, my parents had moved us to Westchester County, which is a suburb of New York City. So like, I lived in the poorest congressional district, which is still that part of the Bronx that I'm in. And my father still has his business on Elder, you know, Avenue, almost 55 years he's been there. Then we moved to the suburb, the second richest suburb in the United States of America. But every weekend, or, you know, holidays was always spent in the Bronx with the family. With that being said, you know, I was gonna say it later, but I knew about the Pan American Games, but I also knew that we weren't going to the Olympics. And the we meaning my uncle is a prize fighter. His name is Harry Arroyo. He was undefeated in his entire career, but he would have been on the Olympic USA boxing team if not for the boycott, which people should really like. This is what I loved about the film. For me, it was the complete intersection of politics and culture, you know, and to remember that time period. But my father definitely told me about it. And, you know, I just didn't have the kind of knowledge that the film puts forth in terms of how important basketball has been, because you grow up Puerto Rican, a lot of people play handball, they didn't connect it to basketball, or, you know, just knowing someone like Babito, who is like foremost historian on basketball culture as a Puerto Rican. You know, it was really good. But yes, I do remember, and it was a moment of pride, you know, and so have other sports moments, but that was probably my first sports memory.
Yes, and Rosa, amplifying what you're saying, I would like Ricardo, Julio, or Freddie to talk about, like, so Rosa said it. This film is not only about basketball. This film is about politics. This film is about the colonial situation in Puerto Rico, and so it introduces and engages with these very difficult and very divisive topics from the perspective of sports. You know, you're talking about identity. You're talking about a deeper sense of citizenship. And so, what made you decide that this particular story of basketball, of sports, was the right way to approach these divisive and difficult topics?
Well, for us, it was inverse, contrario. No, first we want. Let me clear it up. When I was growing up, I heard about the '79 gold medal game between Puerto Rico and the United States. It was a myth. I don't remember it, but I remember my father, and a lot of his friends. They talk about this game a lot of. So when I wanted to show the importance of what was happening in that time, there's no way you can understand. Nobody can understand it if you don't go back to about the migration situation of Puerto Ricans. You cannot explain how that game was, why that game was so important if you don't know the colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. You don't know why these Nuyorican didn't talk Spanish, but were idols of the island. If you don't know how they learned to play basketball, so you have, if you don't, and what was the difference in the basketball that they had? So you got to go back to the Puerto Ricans and Afro Americans relationship in New York City. So in a way, what I wanted to do, I wanted I had to find ways to illustrate, well, the context, the historical context of that game. So I think that we try to touch a lot of issues, a lot of topics. It was very difficult. We left a lot of out. We would like to go deeper in some of them. The movie is just, we didn't have the minutes to do so. But for us, it was very important to contextualize it that way.
Hi, everybody. Wow.
Por ahí está Julio.
Hola,
No,
Julio.
no camera, but sound.
Yes. So, Ricardo, gran abrazo. Thank you for being here during this personally tough times. The passing of your dad, Don Ferdi. I met him so a few days ago, and you're here with us. So mucho amor, okay?
Gracias, mucho. Un abrazo.
Yes. Rosa. So, where is Rosa? Is Rosa around?
No, I think she's offline.
Okay. So let's hope she comes back in line. So Ricardo, Julio, I was there on that day, on July 14th, in 1979, field day.
You and the 20,000 Puerto Ricans that were there.
Yes, I was in the stadium. I remember the Bulls against Bobby Knight. We guarded a minute of silence because that day also Pedro Flores, the great Puerto Rican composer, passed. I was 6 years old, and I remember my parents, it was this, historic game between the Americans and the Puerto Ricans, and my parents saying, hoy tomamos la Bastilla, like today we take on the Bastille. I didn't understand, la pastilla, the pills, I didn't understand. I remember that when it was clear that Puerto Rico was going to lose, my mom told me, look at all the nationalist leaders, Rubén Berríos and their ilk, leaving the stadium, leaving the arena. What a bunch of cowards, and like they are with our team when everything is going well. Now that we know for sure that they're gonna lose, they're leaving. And so it reminds me of this competition that we have in the colonial relationship with the United States, like being first, being second. Can you talk about that, about the sportive, welcome back, Rosa, about that sportive element in this political relationship that we have with the U.S.?
Well, I think that in the sports environment, in the sports community, is in the place that we have made an affirmation of our nation because of the sports sovereignty that we have, and in that context, in every type of sports that we play against the United States, a lot of people saw us as the confrontation between the empire and the colony. So it's like that, the trial of fire. If we can see if we can beat the empire, So in that sports context, you have that the opportunity to beat your oppressors, kind of saying it in some kind of way. So I don't want to, I don't know.
Rosa, I'm glad that you're back because I wanted to ask you that, as you know, many of these most of these amazing players, many of them from the Bronx, are Afro-Puerto Ricans. And so today we're in this moment of reckoning for Black lives, against brutality, against Black bodies and Black people. And we are striving to develop this actively anti-racist agenda. How do you think that this film relates or contributes to that conversation?
I think it contributes greatly, and it doesn't even have to say it. It's what we see, and who these men were. What do they look like? What do their communities look like? I think in this moment it's an important film to show because there's a lot of a historical explaining going on when, around or people particularly stating that Latinos, Latinx people, I don't use that term myself, but that all of a sudden we're exceptionally the most racist people or the most racist ethnic group. And so I'm online a lot and I'm interacting and I get very heated at discussions because it's like, what the film shows is, not only who these men were, who their parents were, what community they came from, it's also showing that as Puerto Ricans, particularly like our African-American brothers and sisters, we're these United States citizens, but what does citizenship mean, right? And I think that's always a point that is missing when we're talking about the history of like solidarity and unity. And there are no other group of people that are, quote, given these rights, Native American folks, but particularly this second and third class citizenship. And then another thing that I think is important is, it's funny because I never heard the word Nuyorican until I went to college. And I think what happens a lot is that language is meant to, language can be elitist. Language could also be about a brand, and those that call themselves Nuyorican were mostly poets, which is like, that's the definition that you define yourself. But I also, kind of reject this idea of migration because it was a forced migration. Our parents had to leave because they could not get jobs. They could not eat on the island, like that's why my abuelo left. That's why my dad left.
What's happening now?
Coming to New York was a big dream, then. But I think, when we use these terms and we're not quite sure, I think part of it is always for Puerto Ricans in the United States throughout the diaspora, Puerto Ricans on the island, to keep us separated, like keep us mentally, physically, and spiritually separated. I spent a lot of time in Puerto Rico, and honestly, I didn't have that experience. I didn't have an experience where I wasn't welcomed or embraced. That's my personal experience. And again, I'll make the connection on this. Many of our African-American brothers and sisters, when they finally go to the continent and their home country, whatever part of Africa, they already have this mentality that Africans aren't going to like African Americans, because that's what African Americans have been taught. So just as African Americans have been taught that those people in that continent, they're not really your people, you're an American citizen, it's the same way that I feel about Puerto Ricans. I don't care where you're at. And really the reason that we rep our flag so much is because we couldn't fly the flag. And I'll stop here because I'm telling you, I watched this film twice. And I was like, this is the film I would use if I was a teacher with any athlete at this moment when sports is being so, and politics are coming together. But that point where one of the older men says, I'll be Puerto Rican even if I'm on the moon. I was like, exactly. And what does that mean for the settler colonialists, for us to still have our Puerto Rican identity? It's very visceral and very real, because in this film, you also see athletes that were
subversive for even maybe talking about Puerto Rican being independista. The only way you get a list like that when that man found it among 1,000 other Puerto Rican athletes is because we were being surveilled by the counterintelligence program here and on the island. So to see that, I'm like, people really gotta just stop with these bullshit kind of academic, and you know, we're coming from an academic space that seeks to separate us. I'm looking at the history that brings us together, and it's there, and we need to talk about it. That's why, you know, I'm sorry I talked so long, but I love this movie so much. I mean, I can't wait to show it in one of my classrooms, especially to younger Puerto Ricans that can understand, if you never get to the homeland, there's a reason that happened, but your Puerto Rican identity is a very real one, and you should be proud, because they've been trying to kill us and everything since we were colonized 1898 post, you know, the American colonial project.
Thank you very much.
Yes, yes. Thank you. You know, Rosa, you said something. I'm going to get you on the record here because it shocked me. So you said something to the effect that you don't use that word. And I bet you were talking about Latinx. Can you talk briefly about why you don't use it?
Yeah,
just to get you on the record, you're former
for sure.
vice presidential candidate. So
no, thank you, because really those terms don't specify race, ethnicity, or even a homeland, right? So I think these would this term Latino was imposed on us. It was also a way to reject Hispanic when people my generation were like, I am not from Spain, like, you know, and all of that kind of stuff. But Latinx really was meant to have, you know, a non-gender conforming term, which I don't mind, you know. But if that's the case, then me as a heteronormative or cisgender woman, I'm not Latinx, you know. And I because if that's made for non-gender conforming people, I don't want that identity taken from their space. But in general, I don't use any of those terms. I tell people you can call me Afro Puerto Rican or Black Puerto Rican. I'm not Black and Puerto Rican. I'm a Black Puerto Rican. And because this is so many discussions happening online, I think it's very dangerous when we continue to have people name us, but also to always have to deracialize ourselves. That Latinos are being told by the colonial mindset, be as white as you can. And then we come to the United States and everybody's like, but you know, you're Black. And you're like, yeah, but why? Like, we got to have those conversations. So I call myself a Black Puerto Rican woman. That's how I identify.
Good, good. We have you on the record for your next electoral campaign. So a little bit back to basketball. I want to ask the directors that, so the film is very explicit about this quality, this beauty that the Nuyoricans and that these players brought to Puerto Rico with their street game, okay? And so they revolutionized how basketball was played in Puerto Rico. Like, fandom in Puerto Rico grew exponentially because of the way that they played the game. But we play basketball in Puerto Rico very differently. Like, the rhythm of the game is different. The way that we do defense and offense and whatnot is very different. It's a more Olympic type of game with zones and different structures, you know, of how to organize the game. So can you talk about how, if the Puerto Rican, meaning from the island, way of playing the game influence the game here in New York or in the United States, if that's the case?
No, much, because what this period brought from the basketball point of view, it was the African American basketball culture that had been going on a lot of decades before. But interestingly, that you say that we played basketball in Puerto Rico since the beginning of the colonization. You know, it was part of the colonization project. You know, to teach us new sports and Christianity, etc., etc. That's why one of the first things that the Americans built in Puerto Rico was the YMCA. So yes, we were playing basketball since the beginning of the 20th century, but it was white people basketball. That's very important. You know, it wasn't the same basketball that was going on in New York City. It was the ones that were brought us through YMCA. So we had developing our basketball like 60 years or so when the Nuyoricans came. And that's what they brought. They brought the black basketball to our island, and that way of playing started changing with the Nuyoricans, because we had the 79 team, then we had almost 10 years later, a decade later, we have the almost bronze medal team in the FIBA World Cup. But from that point on, our basketball have started to be played very, very similarity to what is happening in the United States right now. When we were young, yes, we could say, yeah, this is the way that we play basketball in Puerto Rico, and there's some things that you can find still on the street basketball in Puerto Rico that are from our culture, but the way that we play the game right now, I think there's no so much difference what they're playing in the States, and in fact, in the whole world right now.
But it's been part of what happens is that the globalization of basketball has been huge in the last decade and a half, 2 decades. So we had an advantage those early years in the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s. That's why Puerto Rico, even being a small island, etc., we developed a great basketball program, and we had a very competitive, high-level basketball game that was maybe on par with only the United States basketball, because we have that flair of the New York City street game, and we integrated, and we start developing the players with that. After the 80s, and the Puerto Rican players were a mix of that YMCA basketball game at the beginning and that street game from New York. So we were heads ahead in that in our basketball game in that moment.
Siguiendo lo que decía Fufi, following what Fufi said on the movie about the colonial relationship, that's one of the positive things that had happened, that we, thanks to Nuyorican, we had an advantage from the rest of the world. So that's one of the reasons that we had that strong relationship, strong evolution of basketball since the 70s to the 90s. You know, we were ahead of the whole world, and that's because our colonial relationship. We have to admit it, because that's what brought that sport, and that's what brought Nuyoricans to Puerto Rico. So,
yeah,
one of the only good aspects of colonialism.
Rosa, I want to ask you, like, when you watch the documentary, obviously it's the nature of this sport, particularly at this time in Puerto Rico. It is a very male-centric documentary, and for example, when they sit on that table, you know, around the table, at the end of the documentary, it's all males who are there. I think that Julio, Ricardo, Freddy, they did an excellent job bringing female voices to contextualize more deeply, with more texture, this story. But at the end is this idea of la nación macho, no? The nation as machos. And so do you have any comments about that?
No, I mean, it's basketball, you know, until very recently, women weren't able to create their own leagues, right? Or women weren't encouraged to play basketball. Like where I went to school in a very small town, it's called Alexander Hamilton High School. which is very funny at this moment. But very small town, and basketball was critically important. I ran track and I was a cheerleader for 5 years. Our basketball team won states 3 years, you know, and I was there for 2 of those years. With that said, even though we were quote cheerleaders at that point, we had to learn the game, and we really had to study and see what our brothers were doing there to understand the game, right? So this is a thing too, and I think we have to be careful that the history is being told from those that experienced it. And at that time, it would most only be men. And at this time, right? Like, I don't know what happens as a woman, if I'm a woman in any athletic thing, what happens in that locker room. I know what's happening in mine. So I don't feel any machismo around this. This is the guys who were part of it, you know? And that you can't make something different historically just to fit some type of identity, you know? So no, I like I said, I found the film to be a lot bigger than basketball for sure. And someone who loves the sport, you know, I love seeing the game. I never saw that footage. You know, and I'm like, I know what a boxing and is a 2 or 1 or rebound. Like, I know that kind of stuff. And that's not what they were doing at the beginning, which like, it's like what we Puerto Ricans always do. We make something different. You know, we're forced to take on something, then we do what we do with it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and women in sports before the 80s in Puerto Rico, like, it's practically you don't know anything about that until 82. Until 82, that Angelita Lin was like the first superstar athlete, Puerto Rican woman athlete in the 82 when she won in Havana her 150, I think, 1500 metros run in the I think it was Pan American Games, and she was like the first woman superstar in Puerto Rico athlete.
Now that you mentioned that, Moncho, I will share you a story. After we already were in production of the film, I met a woman from New York City, a Nuyorican. She went back to New York City, and because she learned that I was doing a documentary, I was asking about Nuyoricans and basketball, and she told me a story that she and a lot of young Puerto Ricans came to study to Puerto Rico during the 70s, and they love basketball, so they start playing in Puerto Rico in the university on the courts. And she told me that was something that nobody could handle it. You know, it was people didn't want them to play basketball. They say they shouldn't play basketball, and we're talking about like the early 70s. And this woman, they play basketball the same thing that we're saying about this men. They learn to play basketball in the streets, but unfortunately we were already filming, so I couldn't get to that angle to incorporate it, but it's there, and it happened. I'm talking about like 20 or so women that came to Puerto Rico.
Yeah, what's curious is that when we were looking for the footage, I think one of the earliest footage of people playing in Puerto Rico that we found were women playing basketball.
Oh yes, that's true. That's true.
That was the most old footage that we found. It was women playing basketball.
Yes, in fact, on the early stages of the process, men didn't want to play basketball because they saw that there was a woman's sport. We know, oh no, we Puerto Ricans, we want to play pelota, you know, baseball. But that changed.
Y pelea de gallo.
Oh, y pelea de gallo. So, in fact, we had cartoons of women throwing the ball, and all the boys like, what? No, don't go in there. It was very interesting. I didn't know that.
So I started receiving some questions from the audience. So one of the questions that I have is that, and this is a nerdy basketball question. So we've had a few periods in history, recent history, beginning in 1979, where our team has excelled, the national basketball team. And so how, for example, in the late 80s, early 90s, we have this team, Quijote Morales was still there, Fico Lopez, Ramon Rivas, León, Edgar León, los hermanos León. How do you think this particular 79 team is different from these other incarnations of the national team that we've had, that one of them actually was able to beat the US? How do you think this particular team was different?
Yeah, 2000.
Well, I think the first things that you can see, and it's pretty obvious, is that the late 80s and early 90s team had a team of big guys that can play really good basketball, had a high basketball IQ. You got Piculín, who is a almost 7-footer. You had Ramon Riva, who was almost a 6'10". Because Puerto Ricans, usually we are not like super tall people. And historically, in that period, we had like 5 or 6 guys from 6'9" to 7 feet that were very good, very strong basketball players. And it's something that it haven't happened in the last like 15 years. It was that period, and that was different. The 79 team, we didn't have as a very tall team. We had a team full of strong forwards, maybe small forwards, were the big people there. So that's like at first, I think it comes to my mind is that's one of the big difference between both teams.
Okay, but listen. So here, I'm gonna out here. So
Moncho.
2014. Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, so Bobito Garcia wants to know, who do you think will win if we had the 1979 team play against the 2004 team? So that's the question. Está en mute, Ricardo.
Ricardo, you're mute.
We can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear it. I can hear Ricardo. Can't. Ricardo, no te oye.
Yeah, Rosa, let's see if Ricardo, can you hear us?
Don't ask me that question.
No, I know. No, I have a different question here that we got through the audience as well.
I think that to ask, I think that 2004 will be the 79 team, just because they have I think that they have like it's the same that basically, like I was answering the difference between the 79 and the 90s team. Too many big guys that can do the job. It would be very difficult. They would take all the rebounds from the 79 team, where Charlie Bermudez would be having a nightmare.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Mira, Rosa, I got a question here. Like, there are members of the audience that want to know if you can address the persistence of colorism within the diaspora, and about how you feel this film can open, reach, or facilitate this discussion between the diaspora and people in the island within the intersection of gender, race, class, culture, and so on.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, the film is focusing on the men who were playing, and I'm sorry, as we said before, right? They are visually mostly Black Puerto Ricans, Afro Puerto Ricans. They might not use that language themselves, and all of that, right? But you know, I'm sorry. Can you just tell me the first part of the question? I'm sorry. Jump to the second.
Yes, no, not to
Colorism. I got it,
colorism, yeah.
Yeah, see, for me, that's a lot of the discussions and when they go wrong, because colorism, you can't understand colorism until you understand that in the United States racial contract, one drop of Black blood made you Black. Where if you're going to Latin America, sans Puerto Rico, because I don't put Puerto Rico geopolitically in Latin American politics, people will say you can ascend if you have money and you can ascend class. But part of ascension to class is also your proximity to whiteness, right? So then we're here going back and forth to Puerto Rico, and what are we hearing from people that don't like La Pela? They don't like people in Loíza. And it's like, who's serving you right now, dude? You're in a gated estate community, right? And on a hill. And meanwhile, is a Jíbaro or the Afro Puerto Rican that is doing everything for you. So to understand colorism is also to understand that we don't talk about race well in the United States of America. Race literally comes down to this binary of Black and white. Black meaning African American, white meaning European American. So I often tell my students, watch the news for a whole week. When they're saying Black, is there a Black person from Haiti, from Ethiopia, from Brazil, from Panama? No. Watch how the media frames these racial unconversations, and why. Yes, I think it is important that we, as particularly Puerto Ricans, are lock and step against anti-Blackness. But what I will also acknowledge, and we must acknowledge, is this whole world is anti-Black. Okay? Slavery was anti-Black, capitalism is anti-Black, Condoleezza Rice is anti-Black, and so is Clarence Thomas. I don't care how Black they are, everything they do is anti-us. And we have to very much understand systematic white supremacy, or we end up thinking that we've never been together as a global people who are mostly indigenous and African descendants.
I'm glad that you mentioned Panamanians, because it reminds me of these two of my favorite players in the Puerto Rican League, Rolando Fraser and Mario Butler.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we will ever have a documentary about Panamanian Puerto Ricans, los Panamericanos.
Well, I mean, we need a documentary at Carmelo Anthony. I'm always like, yo, dude's Puerto Rican, right? Just so y'all know. And you know why he was told. He talks about growing up in Baltimore, and there was not a lot of, he said when he grew up, a lot of Latinos. So he said the people that were good to me and my mom were the African-American brothers and sisters around us. So Carmelo, it's very interesting that his ethnicity is never really talked about, and the work that he does in Puerto Rico is not talked about. It's almost like they want to erase him being Puerto Rican because Puerto Ricans, quote, don't play basketball. And this film shows something very different. But that would be a great documentary for one of the brothers to do.
So we are almost at the end of our conversation. I have a very brief story here that I would like you to comment, Ricardo and Julio. So right after this event happened in July 1979, in August 1979, we had two destructive back-to-back hurricanes in Puerto Rico, just like it happened now with Maria and Irma. We had David and Federico. There was massive death in the Caribbean, and it was really tough in Puerto Rico. We lost electricity in the metro area, but my Tio Kike, connected the TV set to the car battery, so we could watch the finals, because the finals were happening back at that moment between Quebradillas, full of Nuyoricans, and Carolina. And so I remember.
By the way, Carolina is my team, by the way.
Nobody's perfect. And so I remember the whole neighborhood like in La Marquesina, the garage of my house, like just trying to watch the game. Like the hurricane destroyed the island, but we kept basketball going. And so I would like you to talk briefly before we close about, you know, how it was like to be there. Why was this, you know, like how the quality of how people felt when this was happening back in the day.
Well, start.
Yeah, Julio.
Okay. Well, basketball after the Nuyoricans came and changed the game. Basketball took by storm the island. Forget about baseball being the first sport of Puerto Rico. Basketball just really took over, and this player became instant idols, and people that you want to be them, they want to emulate. Ricardo and I always tell people that we grew up not really knowing a lot of NBA at the beginning because there was not like many people had cable TV. What we had was Guapa TV, and these are the guys that we want to emulate. I wanted to be Wes Correa. Ricardo wanted to be Angelo Cruz. So these guys were our heroes. So it was like a huge deal, basketball in the 70s and the 80s, like huge.
Just so you know, Ricardo, I'm here before Francis takes over and, you know, finishes the program. Ricardo, I'm Rosa also. I'm here like 2 blocks away from Patterson Houses, from where Angelo Cruz was born. Yeah.
Munch.
Yes. He was my hero also, and he was also called Monchito. So I feel a special connection, very sad story with Angelo. Fran, thank you, Ricardo. A big hug to the family, to Fernando, Sofia, and Julio.
Thank you,
Alejandro. Julio, thank you for being here. And Rosa, an honor to be in a panel with you. Thank you so much. Thank you for being so
for
cool
having me.
and inspiration. So, Fran, take it away.
Well, I'm just going to repeat what you said. Thank you, everyone. This is really fascinating. Thanks for sharing your time and this wonderful film, Nuyorican Basquet. You can find it on Amazon Prime, and I hope you will go ahead and watch it now if you haven't already. We're honored that you could all join us, and please come join us for our next Moonlight and Movies on August 28th. We screen the Dominican Dream about Felipe Lopez and do a conversation with him and the director. Be well, stay safe, and
thank you, everybody.
Gracias, thanks.
bye.
Thanks, bye.